On December 31st, 1862, one of the most famous warships in the world was fighting for its life in a howling gale off the coast of North Carolina. It was losing. Just 9 months earlier, the USS Monitor had shocked the world. It had absorbed point-blank artillery fire, neutralized a seemingly unstoppable enemy, and convinced much of the public that the age of the unarmored wooden battle fleet was ending. To the American people, it was the ultimate invincible machine, an iron fortress that could not be killed. But the Monitor was not fighting a navy off Cape Hatteras. It was fighting the Atlantic Ocean, and the ocean was winning because of the ship's own radical design. To make the vessel immune to cannon fire, its creator had entirely abandoned the high sides of a traditional warship, placing the main deck just inches above the waterline. Against enemy guns in a calm harbor, it was a stroke of genius. In the open, violently churning sea, it was a fatal trap. Icy water crashed over the low deck, forcing its way through ventilation openings and through the failing seal beneath the massive iron turret. As flooding soaked the coal, steam pressure fell, ventilation faltered, and the pumps gradually lost the battle. The invincible warship transformed into a sinking iron coffin. How did a vessel designed to save the United States Navy end up so thoroughly compromised? How was it built under a frantic 100-day contract? And how did that specialized prototype help reinforce a coastal defense habit that would shape American naval thinking for years? To understand the price of the Monitor, we have to go back to the spring of 1861, before the ship existed, when the United States realized its survival depended entirely on the sea. To crush the Southern Rebellion, the Union implemented the Anaconda Plan, a massive, relentless naval blockade designed to strangle the Confederate economy and cut off its access to European weapons. This strategy relied on the traditional might of the United States Navy, a fleet of wind and steam-powered wooden warships armed with rows of broadside cannons. For centuries, thick oak timbers and sheer volume of fire had defined naval supremacy. But a catastrophic blunder at the very start of the war compromised the entire blockade. When Union forces hastily abandoned the Gosport Navy Yard in Virginia, they attempted to burn the steam frigate USS Merrimack to keep it out of enemy hands. They failed to destroy it completely. The Confederacy razed the charred hull, stripped away the burned upper decks, and began constructing something terrifying upon the remains. Intelligence soon reached Washington that Southern engineers were building a heavy ironclad. They were constructing a casemate, a massive, heavily protected, slanted roof covered in thick iron plates over the salvaged hull. This vessel would soon be christened the CSS Virginia. The technical problem facing the Union was severe. A traditional wooden warship survived combat by absorbing enemy fire into its thick oak sides. But an iron casemate angled its armor, allowing heavy solid shot to simply glance off the roof. A single Confederate ironclad could sail into the shallow, confined waters of Hampton Roads, Virginia, and methodically slaughter the wooden blockading fleet. The Union's traditional ships would be unable to penetrate the iron, and their own wooden hulls would be easily shattered by Southern shells. If the blockade failed at Hampton Roads, Washington feared that the disaster could strengthen the case for European recognition of the Confederacy and fundamentally alter the course of the war. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles saw the strategic disaster unfolding. Welles was a journalist and politician by trade, but he possessed the vision to understand that conventional naval doctrine was suddenly useless. The Union could not defeat the Virginia with numbers. It needed an ironclad to kill an ironclad. Normally, designing and procuring a major warship took years of bureaucratic review, congressional funding, and slow shipyard construction. Welles did not have years. The Confederate vessel was already receiving its armor. In August 1861, Wells secured emergency funding and established a special ironclad board. This panel of 3 senior naval officers was tasked with urgently reviewing civilian designs for armored warships. Wells bypassed the slow, traditional procurement channels, demanding a ship that could match the Confederate threat and be built fast enough to intercept it. The board received over a dozen proposals. The proposals ranged from conventional armored ships to more radical experiments. Only a few promised the combination of protection, firepower, shallow draft, and speed of construction the emergency demanded. Wells needed a miracle of industrial speed, but the most radical design capable of meeting the impossible deadline existed merely as a dusty cardboard model. And that model belonged to a brilliant, embittered engineer who had spent years estranged from the United States Navy. That engineer was John Ericsson, a Swedish-born engineering prodigy who had revolutionized steam propulsion and propeller design, yet remained effectively blacklisted by the United States Navy. The hostility stemmed from a bloody disaster 17 years earlier. In 1844, Ericsson had designed the USS Princeton, an advanced steamship championed by an ambitious naval officer named Robert F. Stockton. During a VIP demonstration cruise on the Potomac River, Stockton insisted on firing a massive, experimental cannon he had personally designed, despite Ericsson's earlier warnings about its metallurgy. The gun violently ruptured. The explosion killed several people on deck, including the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Navy. In the inquiry that followed, Stockton escaped official blame, while Ericsson's reputation and finances suffered. The Navy, traumatized by the loss of its leadership, readily accepted the narrative. Ericsson was publicly disgraced and denied his final engineering payments. The ghost of the Princeton left him profoundly cynical. He wanted nothing more to do with Washington or the naval establishment, and initially refused to return. But as the Civil War erupted, Ericsson possessed exactly what the Union Navy unknowingly, desperately needed. Sitting in his home was a dusty cardboard box containing a wooden model derived from an armored battery concept he had first proposed years earlier. It did not look like a warship. It looked like a cheese box on a raft. Ericsson's concept was a radical departure from centuries of naval architecture. A traditional warship required high wooden sides to carry multiple cannons, making it a massive, highly visible target. Ericsson's conceptual leap was to abandon the traditional hull shape entirely. His design was simply an armored raft sitting nearly flush with the waterline. If you removed the high sides of the ship, you removed the target. The enemy could not destroy what they could not hit. The genius of the model might have remained hidden in New York forever, if not for the arrival of Cornelius Bushnell. Bushnell was an industrialist and political operator from Connecticut. He had recently submitted his own conventional ironclad design to Gideon Wells's ironclad board, but the naval officers doubted Bushnell's ship could carry the weight of its armor. Needing an expert to verify his math, Bushnell traveled to New York to consult the exiled engineer. Ericsson quickly reviewed Bushnell's plans and confirmed the ship would float. But before the industrialist left, Ericsson showed him the bizarre wooden model, claiming it was the true answer to the Confederate ironclad threat. Bushnell immediately recognized the genius of the armored raft. He realized it could be built in a fraction of the time required for a traditional ship. He pleaded with Ericsson to travel to Washington and present the design to the ironclad board. Ericsson flatly refused. His pride was absolute, and his hatred for the naval bureaucracy ran too deep. He would not beg the men who had ruined his reputation. Bushnell instead packed the model into his bag and carried it to Washington. Knowing the naval establishment despised Ericsson and would likely dismiss the strange design, he used his political connections to bring it to Lincoln's attention before the board completed its formal evaluation. Lincoln, always fascinated by new machinery, immediately grasped the raft and turret concept and attended the model's demonstration at the Navy Department. The senior officers of the board, Commodores Joseph Smith, Hiram Paulding, and Commander Charles Davis, were predictably horrified by the strange wooden box. Some openly mocked it, but Lincoln stepped in to break the bureaucratic deadlock. Holding the little model, the president offered a folksy, binding endorsement. "All I have to say is what the girl said when she put her foot into the stocking. It strikes me there's something in it." Lincoln's backing forced the board to evaluate the blueprint, but it did not erase their deep, technically founded skepticism. The naval officers were not simply being stubborn traditionalists. They had genuine mathematical objections. Standard warships relied on a deep hull and high sides to maintain stability and a safe center of gravity. Ericsson's design featured a completely flat deck that would sit mere inches above the ocean. The board believed that placing a massive, heavily armored iron cylinder on top of a nearly submerged hull would fatally compromise the ship's center of gravity. In their professional opinion, the vessel would lack the necessary buoyancy to stay upright in a swell. Commander Davis was among those who doubted the strange vessel could survive at sea. The later story that he told its advocates to take the model home and worship it may capture that skepticism, but the exact wording is uncertain. To overcome this resistance, Bushnell had to do the unthinkable: trick the fiercely proud John Ericsson into traveling to Washington to defend his own mathematics. Ericsson furiously and brilliantly laid out the physics of his hull design, arguing that its low center of gravity would make it a stable gun platform in sheltered water. The board finally relented, but the ghost of Ericsson's past still haunted the room. The Navy refused to simply hand a massive government contract to a man they considered a reckless exile. If they were going to approve this floating experiment, they would ensure the government was insulated from any failure. They offered Bushnell and Ericsson a contract of unprecedented brutality. The United States would pay $275,000 for the vessel, but under severe performance conditions that left Ericsson and his civilian sponsors carrying much of the financial risk. If the vessel failed to meet the contract, payment could be withheld or recovered. It was a formula for personal financial ruin. Adding to these punishing financial terms was an impossible timeline. Intelligence confirmed the Confederate ironclad was already nearing completion in Virginia. To intercept it, the contract allowed 100 days for construction. Launch, trials, commissioning, and the voyage south would still follow on their own unforgiving timetable. It was an ultimatum that would have made any rational naval architect walk away. But John Ericsson was driven by an absolute, arrogant belief in his own genius. He and his sponsors signed the impossible bargain. Back in New York, John Ericsson began translating his cardboard model into hundreds of precise working blueprints. He was no longer a disgraced exile. He was the chief naval architect of the Union's most desperate gamble. But every line he drew on his drafting table represented a radical choice that solved a tactical problem while creating a dangerous operational compromise. The first defining feature of the blueprint was the hull. On a standard warship, the height of the exposed hull above the water, a measurement known as freeboard, was substantial, usually 12 to 20 feet. High freeboard kept the crew dry and allowed a ship to sail safely through rough, open ocean. Ericsson set his ship's freeboard at exactly 18 inches. At that height, enemy cannon fire would pass harmlessly over the flat iron deck, or glance off the thick armored overhang protecting the submerged lower hull. The trade-off for this invulnerability was a dangerously small margin of reserve buoyancy. When a wave hits a ship with high sides, the enclosed volume of the hull pushes back, allowing the vessel to ride safely over the swell. With only 18 inches of freeboard, the ocean would simply wash directly across the deck. The crew would be forced to live primarily below the waterline, in cramped compartments illuminated by artificial light. They would rely completely on steam-driven fans for breathable air and mechanical pumps to prevent the ocean from drowning the boiler fires through the deck grates. Ericsson had traded seaworthiness for impenetrable armor. The waterline, normally a ship's most vulnerable spot, was now the entire ship. The second radical feature was the armament. In 1861, a warship fought by turning its entire hull to point a broadside row of cannons at the enemy. a difficult, clumsy maneuver in the narrow, shallow rivers of the South. Ericsson's solution was the revolving turret. The concept of a rotating armored fort was not entirely unprecedented. An American inventor named Theodore Timby had patented a similar concept for land-based defenses. And in Britain, naval architect Cowper Phipps Coles was experimenting with early turret designs. Ericsson's genius was not inventing the idea from a vacuum. It was successfully engineering the synthesis. He was the first to combine an armored cylinder with reliable steam power and integrate it onto a working warship. He placed two massive 11-inch Dahlgren smoothbore guns inside a heavily protected iron drum. The advantage was a 360-degree arc of fire. The ship could steam straight up a narrow channel while its guns rotated independently to track a target on the shoreline or the water. But the physical mechanism required to turn such a colossal weight introduced severe limitations. The turret was incredibly heavy, resting directly on a machined brass ring in the deck to maintain a watertight seal. To rotate, the turret had to be lifted slightly so its weight rested on a central spindle, while steam-driven gearing turned the cylinder before it was lowered back onto the deck seal. This immense weight dictated the rest of the ship's layout. To keep the vessel balanced, the turret had to sit squarely in the center of the raft. As a result, the pilot house, the heavily armored, square iron box where the captain stood to steer the ship, had to be placed far forward, near the bow. This design choice physically severed the captain from his weapons. The commanding officer had no direct line of sight to the gunners inside the enclosed iron cylinder. To coordinate fire, the captain and the turret commander had to rely on a fragile acoustic speaking tube routed underneath the deck. Furthermore, the massive turret sitting directly behind the pilot house completely blocked the captain's view of the stern, while the gunners, looking out through narrow firing ports, could easily lose their bearings as the turret spun. Ericsson's blueprint was a masterpiece of lethal compromise. The raft and the turret theoretically solved the problem of the Confederate ironclad perfectly. But a brilliant drawing could not fight a war. The 100 days began in late October 1861, and properly seasoning, framing, planking, and rigging a traditional wooden warship inside a single yard would have taken far longer. Meeting the deadline required an entirely new method of industrial production. No single facility in the United States possessed the capacity to forge the hull, cast the complex machinery, and assemble the armor simultaneously. Ericsson therefore broke the blueprint into hundreds of modular components, generated precise engineering drawings, and distributed the contracts across New York factories that could build them at the same time. The primary assembly site was the Continental Iron Works in Brooklyn, managed by a young shipbuilder named Thomas F. Rowland. While Rowland's mechanics riveted the iron hull and laid down the flat deck on the slipway, Ericsson's longtime associates at the Delamater Iron Works cast his proprietary, compact steam engines. Miles away, the Novelty Iron Works took on the daunting task of fabricating the colossal turret. Dozens of smaller foundries across the region produced the necessary bolts, ventilation grates, and steam pumps. To maintain this frantic pace, Ericsson had to compromise on the ship's primary defense, its armor. Contemporary American mills could not quickly roll a single curved iron wall of the required thickness, and producing such armor reliably would have delayed the ship beyond the emergency. To beat the clock, Ericsson opted for laminated armor. He ordered the turret built out of 8 separate layers of 1-inch thick iron plates, bolted together. The advantage was immediate industrial speed. Rolling 1-inch plates was cheap, easy, and fast. The trade-off was uncertainty. Laminated armor could deform, separate, or drive fragments inward under heavy impact, although its performance depended on plate quality, fastening, support, and the projectile that struck it. But for Ericsson, a flawed shield delivered on time was better than a perfect one delivered too late. The physical coordination was staggering. Wagons and barges moved massive, prefabricated iron components through the streets and waterways of New York, converging on Roland's slipway in Brooklyn. Ericsson was a relentless taskmaster. He spent his days inspecting the tolerances of parts built miles apart that now had to fit together flawlessly in the freezing winter mud, and his nights drafting the next day's blueprints. The industrial might of the North was being channeled through a single, uncompromising engineer. The sheer speed of the assembly stunned the naval establishment. On January 30th, 1862, less than 4 months after the contract was signed, the USS Monitor slid down the ways into the East River. A crowd had gathered to see whether the heavy turret would capsize the raft. Instead, the ironclad hit the water, bobbed slightly, and settled perfectly upright. But there was no time to celebrate. Intelligence from the south indicated the Confederate ironclad was ready. In early March, the Monitor was hastily commissioned, crewed, and attached to a tugboat. The untested, experimental machine was towed out of the safety of New York Harbor, plunging into the open ocean, rushing south to meet an enemy that had already begun to slaughter the wooden fleet. Before the USS Monitor could fight the enemy, it had to survive its own blueprint. As the tugboat pulled the experimental ironclad down the Atlantic coast toward Virginia, freezing water surged across the low deck, poured down the ventilation shafts, and leaked beneath the heavy turret ring. Water reached the steam belts that drove the ventilation fans, causing them to slip. With the fans dead, smoke, furnace gases, heat, and foul air accumulated in the engine room, nearly suffocating the engineers. For hours, the crew bailed frantically as the vessel teetered on the edge of swamping. But the Monitor did not sink. On the night of March 8, 1862, it limped into the calm waters of Hampton Roads, Virginia. The harbor was illuminated by the catastrophic failure of traditional naval doctrine. The wooden frigate USS Congress was burning in the shallows. The USS Cumberland was sitting on the bottom with its masts poking above the waves. The Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia had spent the afternoon methodically destroying the Union blockade, just as Gideon Welles had feared. The Virginia had anchored for the night, intending to return at dawn to finish off the grounded USS Minnesota. The Monitor had arrived just in time. Had the distributed manufacturing network in New York been even slightly slower, the grounded Minnesota and the surviving Union ships would have faced another day without an ironclad answer. At daybreak on March 9th, the Virginia steamed out to complete its slaughter. Instead, Lieutenant John L. Worden, the Monitor's commanding officer, maneuvered the tiny ironclad out from behind the massive wooden hull of the Minnesota and placed it directly in the Confederate ship's path. For the next 4 hours, the two ironclads battered each other at point-blank range. In the crucible of combat, Ericsson's low profile and armored turret proved remarkably effective. The Virginia's gunners were completely flummoxed by the Monitor's profile. With only 18 inches of exposed hull, there was simply nothing for the Southern cannons to hit. Many Confederate shots passed over the low deck or failed to find a vulnerable point. When they did manage to strike the turret, Ericsson's hurried, laminated armor held together. The solid shot simply dented the iron and shattered. But if the hull was a defensive triumph, the turret arrangement was a command and control nightmare. The extreme trade-offs of the design came due the moment the guns opened fire. As enemy shells hammered the ship, the speaking tube between Worden's forward pilot house and the turret failed, cutting the captain off from the gunners. Inside the turret, Lieutenant Samuel Dana Green was suddenly fighting a blind war as the crew wrestled with the heavy, steam-driven rotation mechanism, and repeated gunfire filled the enclosed iron drum with choking white smoke. Without the speaking tube, Green had no idea which way the ship was steering or where the enemy was located. He and his men fought through long moments of uncertainty, stopping and starting the turret, peering through the narrow firing ports for the Virginia, and firing whenever they could bring the guns onto target. Precise shots at specific weak points were nearly impossible. The blind duel reached its climax when a Confederate shell struck the outside of the pilot house precisely where Captain Worden was looking out. The impact did not pierce the iron, but it blasted fragments and powder into Worden's face, temporarily blinding him and taking him out of the fight. His vision later returned, although the injury left lasting damage. Shortly after, the battered Virginia turned back toward Norfolk after expending ammunition, coal, and the strength of her exhausted crew, while Confederate officers believed the Monitor had already broken off. The Monitor held its ground. It was a tactical draw. Neither ship decisively defeated the other or pierced its opponent's armor. Strategically, however, the Union could claim the greater success, because the Virginia had failed to destroy the Minnesota or break the remaining blockade at Hampton Roads. The Monitor had neutralized the ironclad threat and saved the blockade. John Ericsson was suddenly a national hero, and his radical design was hailed as the future of naval warfare. The public rejoiced, while a Congress deeply traumatized by the near destruction of the wooden blockade demanded more of his miraculous ships. Overnight, the word Monitor ceased to be the name of a single vessel. It became a noun. It became an entire class of warship. But in their desperation to mass-produce the victory, the Navy mistook a specialized emergency prototype designed for shallow, protected waters for a permanent standard of naval architecture. It still expected the type to navigate at sea, though it was never a practical blue water cruiser. Swept up in the Monitor craze, the Navy discounted the near swamping on the voyage to Virginia and ordered dozens of new monitors, doubling down on Ericsson's extreme low freeboard blueprint. Across the Atlantic, European naval architects watched the battle and drew several different lessons. Britain, France, and other powers embraced armored ships and rotating turrets, but they continued to experiment with broadside ironclads, high freeboard turret ships, low freeboard coastal vessels, and hybrid designs. Many placed turrets on larger, more seaworthy hulls, while others repeated dangerous compromises of their own. They built seaworthy, blue-water battleships capable of projecting imperial power across the globe. The United States leaned far more heavily toward heavily armored, low freeboard monitors for coastal and river warfare, even as it continued to operate and build other kinds of warships. Their success reinforced an increasingly narrow coastal defense doctrine. A monitor could cross an ocean, as later voyages proved, but doing so could be slow, risky, and dependent on support. It possessed limited coal endurance, subjected its crew to cramped and punishing living conditions, and lost much of its fighting value in a heavy swell. If a monitor opened its gun ports in rough seas, the ocean would simply pour into the turret. This monitor-centered coastal doctrine contributed to a wider post-war decline, but it was not the only cause. Demobilization, meager appropriations, aging ships, and rapid technological change also left the United States without a modern blue-water battle fleet until the Steel Navy revival of the 1880s. The fatal cost of this doctrine was proven by the original prototype just 9 months after its great triumph. On December 31, 1862, under tow off Cape Hatteras, the original prototype encountered the open sea danger its blueprint had always carried. The winter gale drove water aboard faster than its weakened machinery could remove it, consuming the ship's small reserve of buoyancy until the ironclad plunged into the freezing black water and took 16 sailors to the bottom. For over a century, the Monitor lay lost in the violent currents of the Atlantic graveyard. But in 2002, naval salvage teams finally returned to the wreck. From 240 feet below the surface, they slowly hauled John Ericsson's 120-ton turret back into the light. Today, that massive iron cylinder sits in a conservation tank at a maritime museum in Virginia, bathed in chemicals to slowly cure it of a century of salt. It remains the ultimate physical artifact of naval history's most desperate gamble, the armored turret of a ship whose tactical success could not erase the limits built into its hull.